For today's lesson, you're going to need your watercolor pan. You're going to need a pencil, a paintbrush, a dish of clean water, and a sheet of watercolor paper. I'm going to move a few of these things to the side. And first, let's go ahead and just talk about this watercolor pan. Now, as you look at your watercolors, and if you touch them, you're going to notice that no paint comes off in your hands. And that's because watercolor paints are activated by water. So let's go ahead and first I would like for us to just see the different colors, what the different colors can do. So we have red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple. So we have our rainbow. Purple can also be called violet. Then we also have brown and black. Now let's go and test out each of these colors. So to activate my paint, I'm going to go ahead and dip into my water, and I'm going to take that water into my color. And then I can take and paint with it. If I want it to be a little bit more vibrant, I could dip a couple of times. And so there is my red. Now I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush, and I want to clean it really, really well because I don't want to take red into my orange paint. I want my orange paint to just be orange, so I take a drop of water into my orange and I activate it. And I'm going to do the same thing with my orange. If I want it brighter, I'm going to touch it again. And I don't want my red and my orange to touch on my paper or they will bleed and blend together. I'm going to keep my colors separate. I'm going to go ahead and clean my brush. I can go into my yellow now. I activate it. Then I can clean my brush again, go into my green paint, activate it. I clean my brush. I can go into my blue paint and activate it. I clean my brush. I can go into my purple paint and activate it. And the purple is very dark, so I'm only going to dip into that one time so I can really see that color. I clean my brush. I go into my brown paint and activate that. I clean my brush, I go into my black paint, and I activate that. And now we can really see the whole spectrum of what is in our paint pan. Now from here I'm going to teach you some different painting techniques. So there are 4 main techniques that we use in watercolors. So let's go ahead and draw a line across the top. And let's do a breakup in half, and then one more breakup. And that way we have our 4 different sections. And in our first section, we're going to write something called dry on dry. Now the first word is the way our paint is, and the second way is the way our paper is. So we're going to be using a dry brush on dry paper. Now what do I mean by that? I'm going to take and make sure I take off all of the water out of my brush. So I'm going to wipe it on the side and totally take the water out of that brush. Now I think I'm going to use blue today, so I'm going to go up into my blue, and my blue is already a little bit wet. there shouldn't be any puddles in there. So there just should be a little bit. So my brush is pretty dry actually, and I have pretty dry paint. And now I'm going to go onto dry paper. And with dry on dry, you can pull very fine, thin lines. So it's when you want to draw with watercolor paints. And you can see how I can really make thin things this way. So I want you to go ahead and try some different dry on dry techniques. Dry on dry. Now our next one is called wet on dry. Remember, our first word is our paint, so this time our paint is going to be very wet, but our paper is going to be dry. So this time I'm going to make sure there's water in my brush. I'm going to go into my blue again. If you're using a different color, you can use a different one. And this time there is a lot of water in my paint. Okay, so my paint is wet. My paper is dry, and so now you'll see it will make a big, thick, dark, strong line. So my paint is wet, my paper is dry. So you can see the difference between these two when you do dry on dry or if you do wet on dry. Then we clean our brush, wipe it off, and we're ready to try our next technique. So for this next technique, it is called dry on wet. So once again, our brush is going to be dry, but this time our paper is going to be wet. So I'm going to dip into my water, and I know my water is looking a little bit murky. If I wanted to go clean it out, I could, but you're going to see it actually goes on pretty clear. It's very diluted. So I'm going to wet a little section of my paper. And then I need to dry my brush, because remember, my brush is going to be dry, but my paper is wet this time. So I dry my brush, and I'm going to stick with blue just because it's the same. And I'm going to make sure I get just a little bit of paint on there. So my brush is dry this time, like it was up there. And now you'll see how I can pull a thin line, but how that thin line then bleeds out. So it's creating a thin line that will bleed. So that is dry on wet. Now the last one is called wet on wet. Now for this one, you're going to once again wet your paper. And you probably already guessed it, we're going to use a very wet brush and a very wet paper. And let's see what happens here. So I wet my brush, I have wet paint, and then you can see how much it will spread out. So now the line will be much bigger. You can see the difference between the dry on wet and the wet on wet. Let's try that one more time. It's really fun to watch. You really get to see how the paint moves. So these are 4 basic techniques in using watercolor pans. I hope you enjoyed your lesson. Bye-bye.